Okay, looks like it's, yep, that's it. Yep, time's ticking. Okay, perfect, thank you. So just a reiteration of where we are, obviously we're going to finish up the last two chapters tonight, 22 and 23. Then we have a full text type and principles review on Thursday night. I don't know whether we'll have a few extra visitors. I know of at least one who's coming in from the online course. So we'll see how that goes from a seating standpoint. But then otherwise, then again, a week from tonight, we'll do final math review, which probably will only take us about half a class at most. So that way, you've got, basically what will happen on Thursdays, I'll walk you through kind of, here are the concepts that I think you really need to know for a week from then. And then with the math, I do that 2 nights before because it's easier to remember math for 2 days than it is for a whole week. And then obviously a week from Thursday night, we have the final exam. So I'm presuming everybody is going to take the final exam in here unless anybody wants to take me up on the idea that you could take it at the testing center instead. If you do, just need to let me know probably by a week from tonight. I think as long as you do that, you can do that way. And also on that night of the final exam, you can come in here plenty early if you want, just arrange with me. I'm just not sure how early this room is available, but I can look into that. We can always make sure that you can start early. Again, there's not intended to be a time limit. About 10 o'clock that night of the final, the lights start going off and doors start getting locked and things, but technically we can be in the building till 11. It's never been a problem, but again, if you are concerned about your reading speed, just tell me and I'll see if I can get you started as early as 5:30 or 5 or whatever. Again, time is, it's not meant to be a time limit here. There is a state exam, but not here. So just think about that, and I'm happy to try and accommodate you as best I can that evening. Remember, when you come in for the final, bring a calculator. You're welcome to bring scratch paper, but I'll usually have some. Pencils are important because you're going to do everything on a Scantron, colored in with pencils, things. So, but even there, I'll try and remember to have a few extras if you come in and you don't, that kind of thing. So hopefully, that's it. You can bring your other materials in the test night, because some people like to study right up to the last minute. You're certainly welcome to do that, but once we start, once you start, all your stuff's got to get put away in a bag on the floor or whatever. All right, any questions about any of that before we just get into the text here?
Can we use our calculators on our phones, or we have to?
Yeah, no, you can use the calculator on your phone. That's fine with me here. Again, you can't at the state exam, but for me it's fine. Just make sure that it doesn't beep, that there's no noises to disturb anybody next to you. All right, so environmental stuff. This is really a pretty brief chapter considering what could happen or could go wrong depending upon what area of real estate you practice in. Shoot, just within law, in law school, there are whole environmental courses, that take as long as this course is. You can get an environmental law certificate. I mean, it's really complicated stuff. For residential, it's relatively straightforward. So you're going to get in about 45 minutes all of the environmental stuff you need to kind of get started. But depending upon what else you do, like for me in property management or commercial transactions, you learn more because there are more complicated scenarios. So this is the list I put up here that really sort of the list of materials that either are in the current text or are in the version that Olga has, which is one edition older. So we're just going to run through these. And this is my main concern. Not so much PCBs or CFCs, but asbestos, lead paint, radon, carbon monoxide, and mold. Those are probably the most important things that are listed here. The one other thing that has typically been in this chapter that I didn't notice when I went through it, when they updated the text, is electromagnetic radiation, or EMF. Kind of what you get, the field given off by big high-duty power lines or whatever. Not considered technically, legally a hazardous material, yet some people will refuse to even go out and look at a house. You can have this happen as a buyer's agent. Showing somebody a house, there's power lines across the backyard, they won't even get out of the car. Because there have been some studies that have shown that if you already have cancer, living near an EMF field can cause those cells, cancerous cells, to grow faster. And that's morphed into the idea that, well, those EMF gives everybody cancer. That there's no proof of. So, but what is real there is that those lines are ugly, they have site issues, and if not as many people are willing to purchase a property that has power lines across the back, there's a market value issue, right? And that can be proven through appraisal studies, and I think it's a 4 or 5% ding for that feature alone. So if you had two houses across the subdivision from one another, one that backed up to a vacant field and one that backed up to a vacant field that contained ComEd's 240 kV power lines, that one's going to be, the second one's going to be about 5% less in value if they're identical otherwise, just because of the fewer people who are going to be willing to live in that particular location. All right, so putting this out in a little bit more detail, asbestos is more of an issue in commercial properties, but it does happen occasionally in residential. As the book tells us, it's a naturally occurring mineral. It has wonderful fire and heat-resistant properties. It was used in everything from brake linings to gaskets, to all sorts of building materials. Ceiling tiles, floor tiles, inside of adhesive or mastic, cement asbestos siding panels. Again, insulation, wrap on water heaters, pipes, ductwork, all kinds of places that you might find asbestos. Inside plaster mixes, used for a lot of different things. The term ACM, I think the book uses this now, it didn't used to, asbestos-containing material. A lot of people use that acronym. They'll just refer to, are there any ACMs, meaning did the building test positive in any way for asbestos. So asbestos is a funny kind of material because it's only a health problem if the fibers are airborne. So when asbestos gets dry and it's friable and these fibers get into the air, or when you're working in a factory or if you're in an asbestos mine, then you inhale these things and the fibers get into the lungs and the body can't process it, and eventually there's one of several possible outcomes. Asbestosis, which is not quite lung cancer, but where the lungs begin to sort of grow around these fibers that are embedded there, or either something more that's very much like lung cancer, or this what you've heard a lot about probably on the television, mesothelioma, which is one of the worst types of problems you could have that come from exposure to asbestos. These things are all really prevalent and for those people who are exposed, and hugely expensive, and eventually usually lead to premature death. So in that regard, it's a problem. Why do they say it's kind of funny? Well, because when we realized what a big problem asbestos was and realized how ubiquitous it was, how much it is everywhere in certain kinds of older buildings, the first thing we did is we rushed in to try and remove that. And we spent millions upon millions of dollars removing ACMs from buildings. And when you do that, when you touch the asbestos there, you of course make it friable and possibly make it airborne. So you have to send people in hazmat suits, you have to pressurize the air in such that that air that's contaminated with asbestos fibers doesn't get outside the building before those fibers can be removed from the air. Very expensive. We finally realized after about 10 or 15 years of trying that method that encapsulation is far better than abatement. So the idea of abatement is removal, encapsulation means leave it in place. So let's just use, for example, let's just say that this floor tile, and it is not because it's fairly new, had asbestos in it. In fact, in a building that was, say, 30 years older than this one, there would be a good chance that the original floor tile had asbestos in it. VAT is used a lot for vinyl tile. It was vinyl asbestos tile. When VAT is used, that term today, it's usually meant that it's vinyl asphaltic tile, but you still use the same acronym. Not only is there asbestos probably in that kind of floor tile in an old enough building, but there may also be in the mastic. So if you're gonna cut into that floor, you need to realize that, oh, we're gonna end up having asbestos fibers in the air. How do we deal with it? But if you don't have to cut into the floor to change the plumbing or to do something else, you're better off just leaving it in place. So coat it with a sealer, put carpet over it. Coat it with a sealer, put more vinyl tile over it. Leave it in place. It's not at all uncommon to find in some older houses you'll have this fairly thick cement shingle on the side of the house. Those might be cement asbestos shingles. Leave them in place. Side over them if you must, but it's better to just not penetrate them at all or break them at all. Just put a real good heavy thick coat of paint on it and do that every 10 years and forget it. Because if the fibers aren't in the air, then asbestos isn't hazardous. The only other thing to recognize as a real estate agent with asbestos is you cannot look at something and say that's asbestos or that contains asbestos. Legally, in Illinois, the only way to know that is to have it tested by a laboratory that's specifically licensed for asbestos testing in the state. So the role of an inspector then is to point out to the buyer or to the buyer's agent, if the buyer is not present at inspection, I'm concerned this material might contain asbestos. see if you can take a sample with the homeowner's permission, and then send that off to a separate lab, pay for a separate test, and have them tell you. And then if there is asbestos, now the buyer and the seller have to decide, how are we going to deal with this? Again, because if you're going to remove it, that's where it's a problem. If you can leave it in place, not a problem. Questions at all about asbestos? Okay. Moving on to what's probably one of the most prolific things you'll end up dealing with in terms of disclosure forms and paperwork, we have is lead. So paint was the main concern, but lead is a wonderful material, and in fact, a lot of people, not necessarily right around here, but along the Mississippi and up into like southwestern Wisconsin, lead was so available that when farmers came from Germany or wherever and bought their 160-acre farms in the mid-1800s, some of them up there just literally quit farming and started mining lead because it was right on the surface. And by the mid-1800s, a soft, pliable, easy-to-melt metal like lead was very attractive for use in armaments, meaning in bullets, and in other kinds of metalworking. In fact, since it's so malleable, even when it's in a pure lead form, it was used for water pipe. There's still lead water pipe in Chicago, in Morton Grove, and Wheaton. It's in the ground, and the villages know it, and they don't do anything about it, and they're not going to. The interesting thing about lead water pipe is if you coat the pipe with a slurry of the right kinds of minerals once a year or however often it's appropriate, those minerals will adhere to the lead, and the water will never actually come in contact with the lead. And because the lead pipe itself is malleable, even though the earth moves, it freezes and thaws and shifts and such, the lead tends to not break. It just sort of bends. And so once it's there, it's actually a fairly useful material, so long as we're not drinking water that it's contaminating, or that we're not coming into contact with it, or the dust produced from trying to remove it, or whatever else. The main issue with lead comes down to, look on the next slide, it comes down to interacting directly with humans. So in 1978, the big idea was, let's ban lead. There's other ways to get pigment and to dry out oil-based paint. Latex paint was becoming the norm anyway, and so we were able to phase it out entirely. A house like mine that was built before '78, when I sell it, I have to fill out a lead disclosure form. But I'm pretty sure my house is entirely latex paint, except for any oil paint that I've added in recent years. So there's probably no lead in my home, but I don't really know that for sure. So when you go to remove lead, if you ever have to do that as a remodeler, you're going to do your own stuff, keep in mind that it is a licensed activity, but also if you remove lead in the wrong way, like you sand lead-based paint, you're going to get dust. If you inhale that, you could get lead poisoning. It's not an immediate thing for adults, but prolonged exposure, again, is toxic. The fumes, you use a paint stripper and you heat that paint, the fumes that are given off by that can be problematic. And of course, for any kind of either lead water pipe or the solder that's oftentimes used on copper piping, lead and tin is a very effective solder mix. You could potentially get some toxins from that. The solder by itself isn't usually a big deal, but they have tried to ban the use of lead in solder using tin and some other compounds. They've really not come up with a good suitable product, but they are trying to do that. So the main thing here is children age 6 and younger, the development of the brainstem and cognitive development is impacted negatively by lead being present. So it's not at all uncommon that young children are tested for lead either when they go to visit their doctor, that's a requirement by law. Public schools oftentimes are testing or requiring this. And once it's in the body really has no way to get rid of it because it's a naturally occurring mineral. The human body evolutionarily has never ingested it, so it doesn't know how to process it. It just sort of attaches to bone and other kinds of things and stays there. So this disclosure form that's in the text is something you'll have to use on every residential dwelling built before 1978. Whether there's lead there or not, whether the people have any knowledge of lead or not, you have to go through the disclosure form. So get familiar with it. It's true for apartments for rentals, it's true for single family for sales or rentals of any kind. So looking at that disclosure form, the responsibility that falls to the seller or to the landlord and that also run to their listing agent is that the seller needs to be informed The agent has to ensure that the seller complies, and the agent has to sign an initial form, but basically the seller and the landlord have to disclose, yes, we do, or no, we do not have any knowledge of lead, and yes, we do, or no, we do not have any knowledge of any tests on this property that have ever been done. There is no obligation to test whatsoever. The only body that I know of that has self-subjugated themselves to test is HUD. When HUD takes back foreclosure properties now, they do a lead paint test. So every HUD home that's in a foreclosure process, or it's really an REO, that's been taken back by HUD, that's sold, will have a lead-based paint report. And many of them have some kind of paint. And they'll have an estimate of what it will cost to remediate. That was based on public criticism of HUD saying, you know, here's this disclosure form, you're telling us we need to do this, and you don't even do it, so why should the rest of us kind of thing? So HUD's taken on that, but nobody otherwise has an obligation to test. But it is important to know that buyers, by law, have a 10-day statutory right to be able to test. So you can refuse to sell somebody the house, but you can't refuse to allow them that 10-day test. Most buyers don't bother. I can't even tell you what a lead-based paint test costs. Some places charge you by the room, some by the job. I haven't had to have a lead test done by a contractor or a testing firm ever, so I don't really know. And then the other thing, and I brought a copy of it here, I think I left it somewhere. You have to provide this protect your family from lead in your home disclosure form. So that's what it's called. This is what it looks like. This is just a badly printed copy of the PDF. You can pass it around if you want. We'll just look at it on break. There's nothing really here, a big deal, except for stuff that scares you about all the things you have to worry about with lead, so I'll toss it here. It's kind of printed upside down on the inside. It's a copy worth seeing. But as a buyer's agent, or if you're representing a tenant, it's your responsibility to hand that to your buyer client on every dwelling that meets this criteria, and so you don't want to forget doing that.
The criteria being 1978.
Yes, yeah. And what I was just wondering about today, actually, is whether it's acceptable to just email them a PDF of the file. You can download this from the EPA's website rather than pay to print them. I would think that would be satisfactory. I mean, it's just an awkward setup. You got to print it as a booklet and staple it together correctly or whatever. You can buy them in batches, but I would think today I would just try and email them as a PDF. Maybe even have them available on my website somewhere for people to download. But yeah, it's built before '78. Now I have, on a couple of rare occasions, had attorneys advise their sellers to complete lead-based paint disclosure forms on properties built after '78, just to avoid any liability. I don't know if that's ever going to become the norm. I thought it was a bit unusual, but maybe it was the same attorney on two different deals, but that was that's something you could theoretically see. So regarding testing, I mentioned already that doctors and schools are going to test kids. I think the law is age 6 and under, I've been told, but some public school systems will test up to the age of 8. The real authority on this is the Illinois Department of Public Health. So I'll give you a quick story that what happened with me on one property with lead, because the book talks about you've got to be a licensed contractor to remove lead, all this stuff. So we were under contract on a duplex down in Joliet, old house that had been converted to a duplex. And there were renters on the first floor and renters on the second floor. The guy on the second floor was actually the handyman for this family that owned a dozen properties or so around Joliet. So one of the children, age 6, tested positive for lead poisoning at school. This is after we were under contract. I had, of course, had clean disclosure forms prior to that. So Illinois Department of Public Health was notified, and they came out and they tested, and they found that there was lead paint on one window. Couldn't identify it exactly, but the window didn't seem to be on the trim, just on the window itself. So rather than have a contractor do it, the owner and his handyman, so it was one of the tenants and the owner, went and they just removed the wood sashes, the old wood windows, and disposed of them in whatever manner they chose to, and put brand new wood sashes in there and cleaned everything up and called Department of Public Health, who came out and retested in a prompt way. Again, this is all while we're in the normal contract period. And the Department of Public Health tested it, seemed okay. Then they rattled these new sashes in their old frames. Dust came down, and they tested that. They tested positive rather. First was negative, and the second one was positive. In other words, there was still lead paint in the framing. So they the owner and his handyman took that all apart, got rid of all of the wood in there, rebuilt the frame entirely, put a brand new window in there. DPH came out about a week later, retested, everything was clean. And that passed and the deal closed on time. So what happened in that situation was, once the test happened, and the seller called me and said, hey, here's the scenario, what do you want to do? Or what do we need to do? I told him what we were going to have to do. I said, okay, here's what happens. I'm going to send you new disclosure forms, and you're going to fill them out for lead and for the residential real property disclosure form. Secondly, I'm going to contact the broker of the other who's under contract and let them know we have this problem. So that's the part that I did. The buyers didn't worry about it at all. The tenants never left. They stayed, because once that test was over, the tenant realized, we now know for a fact this is a lead-free property. We go somewhere else, we don't know what we're going to get. So by handling the disclosure properly and being straightforward and upfront with the other party and doing it quickly, we literally closed as originally scheduled and had no hiccups of any kind along the way. Nobody backed out. There was no negotiation of price, nothing. So it all worked out just fine. But the one thing that's stuck with me, and I also partly wanted to mention, is the guy that was the managing broker for one of the offices in Joliet, who was representing the buyers. And what he said to me was, I think we're really lucky. And I said, what do you mean? He said, I think we're lucky that we had you as the listing agent, because I don't think that most listing agents would have told us this was happening. And that really bothered me a lot. That here's a guy who made his living as a managing broker in an office who thought that little of his fellow agents. To me, it was an easy decision. There was no decision. We had one option, and it was my job to make sure my client knew that this was what we were going to do. I didn't ask him, are you okay with this? I said, this is what we're going to do. He never objected, and we just carried it out that way, and everything worked really well. You might, I suppose, see something like this on a state exam. I don't really know, but just be advised that Illinois licenses not only contractors, but also workers. There are different levels for lead abatement workers and supervisors and all that stuff, and continuing education requirements. So they take it very seriously. I have no idea how many contractors are even in that business. Oftentimes it's painting firms that they have to deal with this when they go in to do a painting job, and they're going to paint over lead-based paint. And lead-based paint does not have to be removed, by the way. If you find lead paint on your property and you want to leave it there, you can do that. A good coat of latex primer covering over lead paint will solve the contact problem. The issue is when it starts to peel off, and when oil-based lead paint was put on woodwork and everything, it's often put on very thick, and it will sometimes peel off in sheets. And I have been told, I can't confirm this, that that paint actually has a sweet taste to it. And so this is one of the reasons why sometimes toddlers will teethe on woodwork in a house. They'll find that at the right height, and they can gnaw on it a little bit, and then, ooh, this tastes good. And that's a big problem, because if that's lead-based paint, then they're going to get that ingested and get lead poisoning. Questions at all about lead or lead paint or whatever? All right, radon is not as big a deal in other parts of the country as it is in Illinois, as we'll see here at the end, because Illinois has a separate statute. But basically, radon exists everywhere. It's in the air you're breathing now. It's just a question of what amount. So the body is able to handle some radon without any problem. And there is a great dispute, even internationally, as to what the proper levels of radon are, or acceptable levels are. But we're stuck with what we're stuck with in the United States, and it's something we have to work with. So buildings are designed in such a way that air is naturally drawn in from the outside, either because you intentionally are bringing fresh air in as part of your heating and cooling system, or it's just the natural fact that we heat our buildings. And so when you heat inside air, it rises, right, and the outside air is then drawn in, particularly the underground air is cool. So that means that any gases that are in that air will also come in through the floor cracks or cracks in the foundation, or if you have a crawl space, or even a building on a slab like this one, where you might just come up through the cracks or whatever in the floor. So the question is, how much, since it's a Class A carcinogen, meaning it's cancer causing in humans, how much can we handle? And so this idea of 4 picocuries per liter is what has been determined by the federal EPA as the action level. So in any residential dwelling, if the test shows up a level of 4 picocuries per liter or higher, then it's some kind of action is or should be required, and what that action is at a minimum is disclosure. has to be disclosed. So the federal EPA is responsible for radon stuff overall, and they actually suggest that if you're thinking of selling your property, you do a year-long radon test. You get your own test kit and you test it over a complete series of seasons so that you have this complete, sort of long-term view of things. That's not what we do for real estate transactions because nobody can wait a year to sell their place. So with a real estate transaction, that test takes place over a period of a few days. And it's done at the lowest living area, which is usually there'll be some kind of a test kit on the first floor, but also down in the basement or in the crawl space, it'll be tested there. Particularly again if there's a basement, and the basement is sealed off. The windows are closed and taped, the door is closed, and you're asked not to go into your basement for several days. So you have kind of this worst case scenario test of this lowest area in the house, which may or may not be realistic of what somebody would encounter. But the concern is, well, what if the teenager goes and lives in the basement? What if you finish the basement and people are spending lots of time down there? How much radon gas are people going to inhale over a long period of time? So in Illinois, there's an absolute requirement for a disclosure form that's basically designed on the lead paint disclosure form. And this Radon Awareness Act is what happens, and it covers most, there are some exemptions, but it covers most transactions. So again, get used to using that form, and there's no time limit. And radon gas is such that it either will exist in an area, meaning a kind of a small geographic region, or it won't exist at all. Radon doesn't decide to come up through one house and not come up through the neighboring house. It's not how it works. This gas, being lighter than air, filters its way up through the ground, basically, and once it gets to the open air, it just mixes in with the air. But what ends up happening is that if you have clay soils, then the radon will come up as it's working its way up through the earth, and it'll hit that clay, and it'll work sideways until it finds fissures or cracks or crevices, or sandy or rocky soil, which is very porous, and it will come up through there. So if you have a heavy soil overburden, or even if once you've dug a basement, you have clay soil, it's anywhere's fine, thank you. You can throw it anywhere, that's fine. You can keep it, I don't really care. This clay overburden will keep the radon from coming through. So when you go into a subdivision where there is no radon in half the houses that have been tested, the idea, I'm telling you, is probably there won't be any radon there at all. But if you find that there is radon in all of the houses that have been tested, there's probably a radon problem in every single house, including the ones that haven't been tested. Because the problem is, you've probably excavated through our topsoil and clay overburden, you're now sitting on rock or sandy soil, and the radon is just going to filter its way right up through that. So home builders will tend to pre-test today, and either every house will have radon mitigation or no house will have mitigation, if we're talking about new construction. All right, so what are your responsibilities? Obviously, again, inform the seller, and you have to sign and initial this form. So you need to make sure that the seller does what they're supposed to do, which is be aware of it, fill out a form, even if they're just saying, I don't have any knowledge, and I don't have any tests that say anything about radon. Again, no obligation to test. A radon test is maybe anywhere from $100 if you go straight to a radon testing company. Some of the home inspection firms will charge you 2.5 times that. All they do is call a radon inspection firm and have the radon testing firm come out. It takes 3 or 4 days, and you'll find out immediately if you're at 4 picocuries per liter or less. You might want to encourage a seller, if they want to save a little money, go to the hardware store, buy their own radon test kit for $25. That they have to pay another $10. They send the kit in and get it tested and get results back, maybe even before they even list the house, or certainly before it's ever called for. That way they'll know in advance, and they'll have test results they can share with the buyer. If you do test positive for radon, what do you do if you want to mitigate it? The best way to handle it is to get rid of that radon-laden air that is coming up through the floor or through the cracks in the walls or up through the sump system, whatever it might be. And the easiest way to do that is to put pipes down through the floor or vent cover over the sump pit with a pipe coming off of that, and draw that air into this system, this ventilation system, and vent it out up above the ridge line of the house, or at least well above the highest living areas of the house. So in new construction, these radon chases will just be built right in as if it was a vent stack for plumbing, and it's very inexpensive to do. If it's older construction and you have to build that on the outside, sometimes you'll just see a 4-inch PVC pipe running up right up the outside of the house and back or whatever. That's to vent that radon gas. And you might notice when you go in basements, if you see, there's a sump pit or several sump pits that they're covered with a plastic lid and a pipe running through that besides the sump discharge, that's probably for radon gas. You can also drill holes through the slab in other areas and draw the gas up that way if you need to. $800, $1,200, $1,500 to do that. Systems depend upon the size of the house and how bad the radon is. Most radon remediation quotes will guarantee you that they'll bring the level down below the 4 picocuries, in which case you're free to transfer the house and everybody's happy. 2 different ways to vent that gas out once you have the pipes in place and have it going. One is a passive system that sort of uses the natural airflow and it just goes out automatically. And another is to put a fan in there and with a gauge so that the gauge will know what the radon level is in the system. Once it gets up to the 4 picocuries per liter, the fan will kick on and draw that air out and vent it up outside the house. Other places in the country, just be aware, there are some places in the country where the radon levels are so high that I don't know how they do any real estate transactions. It's my understanding one of the problems with granite is that granite itself gives off radon at a higher level than what's allowed. So you can seal granite countertops to avoid that problem, but if you're living in the Northeast or if you're living over top of a granite belt or you're living in the mountains that are granite, you're probably going to have higher radon levels in the outdoor air than you're allowed to have inside your house. So again, if you leave this area and go to some other place, then you might find a whole different situation with radon than what we do here. All right, another thing, and I'm not going to test you on this one here, but formaldehyde, it shows up in particularly in fumes, whether it's in glues or adhesives or inside of building materials or whatever. And there was a product used for a while called UFFI, where it would just continually give off foam. If you use it to insulate an attic, it will blow in insulation, spray in foam insulation. That you continue to get these formaldehyde fumes, and it causes basic skin and eye irritation. I may have mentioned earlier in the class that the idea of nothing like a new car smell. Well, now we figured out that new car, new house smell is actually toxic. Right, we're giving off fumes. So formaldehyde is not used in building materials anymore. But again, in older property, you might find it, or certain kind of glues or resins that might actually still be there. So just to be aware of it. It shows up a little differently in these different building types because of the different building materials, but it can be either location. And I think in the past, formaldehyde has caused more problems as part of sick building syndrome than it has in residential dwellings, as far as I know. I had one client one time suspect she had UFFI in her attic of her house she was buying. She was a broker. I said, "Do you want to note that? Do you want to deal with that?" She goes, "No, I'll never come up in the attic." Okay. So she never tested it, never did anything with it. All right, carbon monoxide. This is a more significant issue, although it's not really a huge problem. You need to be aware of carbon monoxide. Really, Illinois has a carbon monoxide detector act. So every home, even if it's your private residence, whether it's an apartment, your house, a condo, whatever, you have to have CO detectors within 15 feet of any room in the house used for a sleeping area. So if you don't have that now, you're in violation of the Illinois Carbon Monoxide Detector Act. So this comes up really as part of the transfer. And you can have combo devices. So if you have a smoke alarm somewhere, you can just turn it into a combo smoke alarm and CO detector. You can buy them for anywhere from $15 to $40 at Lowe's or Home Depot, depending on how much you want to spend. Just like any other smoke detector, change the battery once a year, test it regularly, make sure that they're working. But the idea is that any burning of fossil fuels, including natural gas, which we do inside of our homes here, creates carbon monoxide. Fortunately, out of all the fossil fuels, natural gas, which is really mostly methane, I believe, burns the cleanest by far. In fact, there was a test done on Honda, has a Civic natural gas vehicle that they sell in California, and they did a test of the air coming out of the exhaust, and it was cleaner than the air that was going into the intake in Los Angeles when they did this test. So however they managed that, I don't know, but it just shows how clean natural gas burns. But you probably should have a CO detector even near your gas cooktop or your gas range, even though we run that in, we just cook on it, we have open flame, we don't think about it. But if it's on long enough, you could get enough of a CO buildup. It's a problem. The only cases I've ever had with past clients mentioning something to me, I had past clients purchased a home that had a fireplace in it. It was a gas-fired fireplace. And sometime after they purchased the home, they had a second flue. They noticed that the flue didn't really close very well, if they were losing a lot of air up the flue. So they had a second flue installed at the top, where now they had two flues to close. Well, they could always look at the one that was right above the firebox and see whether it was open or closed, but they couldn't remember which way the chain had to be pulled to open or close the one up on top. So they ran the fireplace one day for hours, and the flue at the top was closed. In the meantime, fumes just built up and built up and built up in the fireplace till eventually they came into was it in the living room or wherever room in the house that the fireplace was in, and they started feeling, they had stiff necks, and somebody started getting nauseous, and then, eventually you can lose consciousness, and they realized what the problem was. About the time they realized what the problem was, a CO detector they had in a whole other area of the house on that same floor went off. And so they were fortunate to have that case. But anywhere you're going to burn natural gas, near your water heater, your furnace, by law now near the bedrooms, you should have a CO detector, because it's there to make sure that if the device all of a sudden isn't properly vented, and what you can have with vents, you can get birds build a nest in a flue for a furnace, and next thing you know, the thing isn't venting properly, or the device stops burning the fuel properly, or whatever. So again, it's a good idea to have. So the biggest thing you need to know about carbon monoxide, again, is it exists in every dwelling we have around here, because we're almost all burning natural gas for heat, and the Carbon Monoxide Detector Act. And make sure your sellers have CO detectors when they're going to sell, and that your buyers are aware that they're supposed to get them, and if not, get that taken care of in one way, shape, form, or another. It's not expensive. Homeowners, buyers and sellers can do it themselves, but they should be properly appraised of it. All right, again, I'm not going to test you on PCBs or CFCs, but I just wanted to put slides up here so you could at least be somewhat familiar with them. My experience with PCBs was one of the first sort of huge man-made environmental problems, and it dealt mostly with electrical components. I'm pretty sure when AT&T shut down their factory in Montgomery and demolished it along the river at US 30, that's a big part of what was in the soil were PCBs. Stuff that they used in manufacture of electrical components. Transformers, PCBs were used in oil to keep the transformers cool. Electrical transformers run a lot of power to them, they get really hot. And that stuff would leak and get into the soil, and it's a big problem. And there is no way to clean that up. So the way that I'm familiar with removing PCBs from soil is to literally incinerate the earth. You literally go out and get a big conveyor belt and excavating equipment, and you put the soil on a conveyor and run it into a big portable furnace, and you burn the soil and turn it into, incinerate it, and that gets rid of the PCBs. That's the only cost-effective way that I know of. It's hardly cost-effective to remove PCBs from contaminated soil. And at the time when that was discovered, it was a big deal, because I think people were thinking, we can't get it, we're doomed, we can't get rid of this wherever it is. But you can. Keeping in mind that once soils are contaminated, that stuff tends to migrate downward, right? Gravity will pull it down into the earth until, of course, it hits a water table, in which case it goes wherever the water goes. CFCs you're probably mostly familiar with in terms of the ozone layer, right? The stuff, aerosol spray can and whatever else. Well, CFCs are being replaced. Hydrofluorocarbons, I think, are the latest thing. We first tried with hydrochlorofluorocarbons, and those HCFCs are also, I think, being considered now pollutants. But we're talking about companies like DuPont and others that are trying to engineer different gases and different things that can be used to do the same thing. So in buildings, halon, for example, was a common fire suppressant, particularly in a restaurant, because you can't put a grease fire out with water. So halon would be used, and you have those kinds of systems. But halon is in and of itself a CFC, and it's problematic. So halon manufacturing was stopped in 1994, and all of the halon that is still used in fire suppression systems around the world is being recycled. There are actually halon banks. So if you dismantle a halon system, you have to remove the halon gas, take it to the bank, which stores it for somebody else to reuse it, because nobody's manufactured halon in 20 years. Again, we're trying to figure out other ways to do that. mentioned, aerosol spray cans, whatever. Refrigerants, getting back to building stuff, Freon, using in air conditioners, this is being replaced over time. So they're not banned CFCs, they're being phased out as we can figure out how to replace them with other things and other gases. And it's taking a while to do that. So again, you're talking about big companies like DuPont and Siemens and other people who are trying to figure out what can we do to replace these chemicals that have otherwise done exactly what we wanted and aren't necessarily hazardous to humans, except for we don't want to blow away our entire outer atmosphere and have the full brunt of the sun affecting us and burning us up. Mold is not really a hazardous material legally at all, but it's in the text, and so I wanted to bring this up, and it's something you're liable to run into in practice because of the way it's thought of. So mold is a naturally occurring organic fungus, and you're breathing mold spores right now. The body is accustomed to having a certain amount of mold in the air, and your immune system would collapse if mold didn't exist for some reason at all. It's just a natural part of the environment. But even with all of that being the case, HUD requires on their sales contracts that mold be disclosed if it exists, required by HUD rule. The Illinois Association of Realtors, and probably actually the National Association of Realtors, has this mold disclosure form that you have in your textbook. And so you'll do deals here where if you're the listing agent and you didn't ask your seller about mold, which by the way I never bother to do unless I know it exists, the buyer's agent may say, where's the mold disclosure? That's between you and your seller now if you want to go through that process, because there's no law compelling you to do that. Mold can sometimes be a huge problem, but oftentimes it's blown out of proportion because of people's concern and ignorance about what it really is. So the thing about mold is it likes to live where we like to live, a place that's warm, and maybe a little bit moist, reasonable amount of humidity. Mold eats stuff that's organic, including the paper on the face and back of drywall, wood, joists, any organic material that might be in insulation. So when you get mold spores growing on some bit of building material, unless you eliminate the moisture and eliminate the food source, that organic material it's feeding off of, you're never going to get rid of the mold. So let's say that we have a little bit of mold on a ceiling tile here. This would be a better example if this were a one-story building or an upper floor. I can go get a really mild bleach solution and just wipe that off and it's gone. The problem is if that is soaked through the ceiling tile and if it's moist because there's a source of water up above there, I'll be wiping that mold off of there for the rest of eternity because it will continue to come back. You have to get it at the source. So one of the problems with mold is that if you do find it in some areas, you have to wonder, is it solid, all the way inside the wall, for example? Mold has been known to be so bad that it would, be growing fully in a wall cavity and come all the way through the gypsum and start appearing on the face of the drywall, in which case you can wipe it off and it looks better, maybe even repaint it, but it'll just continue to come back through it. So in that case, it's a sign of a bigger problem and how to deal with it. Some people are allergic to certain kinds of molds. There are a few types of molds that are toxic, but it's just a few. Just because mold is black doesn't mean that it's toxic, because some of the molds that are toxic happen to be black in color. I have a brother who has been on legal disability for 15 years because he suffered from fungal meningitis and inhaled some mold spores that are indigenous to the area here and hasn't been able to work since because of that. Yet it's still, I'm telling you, it's a relatively rare kind of thing. So it's the kind of thing that you need to really sort of pay attention. If an area is well vented, if it's kept dry, if you're using building materials that don't have organic matter like paper in them or wood in them, much less likely you're going to have any kind of a mold problem. You find obviously mold in the shower from time to time. Why? Because it's damp. You keep it dry or you clean it out, then that problem tends to go away. Again, keep in mind you have to remove the source of moisture and remove the source of food. Otherwise, all you're doing is cleaning the surface. Mold is a bigger problem the more humid the location is. Having lived in a few other places other than here, I can tell you that humidity has a huge impact. How well buildings are designed and how well they're ventilated has a lot to do with it. I did one water intrusion problem in Houston in 1983. The exterior wall was face brick. The driving rains coming in from off the Gulf were so hard they would literally almost drive right through the brick. And brick is porous. Brick will pull moisture into it. And there was a cavity, and then there was gypsum layer, and then there was metal studs that were 6 inches, and then there was drywall on the inside face of this building, and then there was vinyl wall covering inside of that. The design was such that the dew point of this wall in South Texas was that dew would actually form on this gypsum, exterior gypsum board because of the moisture inside the cavity, that made that gypsum board permanently wet, and it got to where the drywall was so wet inside the wall because of the humidity, and because of the vinyl wall covering inside the wall, it couldn't vent even into the space, that after just 1 year, it's literally brand new construction, 1 year in this commercial building, I could walk my finger up to a 5/8 inch drywall and go and punch it right through with no more force than that. It had just literally turned to mush. So I'm not saying that mold isn't ever a problem or that moisture isn't ever a problem, but again, investigate it before people freak out. Whether you have to deal with the mold disclosure or not will depend on your circumstances. Does mold ever kill deals? Yes. Some people are afraid of it. Some people will come to you with a doctor's note. I can't buy this house because mold has been discovered here. But those are rare occurrences. Questions at all about mold? Again, big things are radon and lead, most likely to be around. All right, groundwater issues, mostly, again, depending upon what you're dealing with, if you're getting into more complex properties. We're talking really here, and I'm going to jump through the rest of this stuff pretty quickly. You're talking about, getting, like underground storage tanks that leak. You're talking about PCBs in the soil. You're talking about anything else like that, that once it gets into the soil, it can end up in the water. And that's a big problem. So that's really what we're looking at and talking about here. I remember thinking about underground storage tanks where the Citgo station is downtown Aurora, almost downtown Aurora, Illinois and Broadway. That location, before they replaced the tank some years ago, had a leak. I think it was called Markley's at the time. I don't know if it still goes by that name. But they found out it had a fuel leak when there was an oil slick or a gasoline slick showing up in the Fox River, which is, what, a full block away along Illinois. So those tanks had leaked long enough in the ground that they just meandered, until eventually they hit the Fox River, and then they realized they had a problem. So then all of that had to be cleaned up. So again, if you get into commercial industrial stuff, you need to pay much more attention to these tank issues and underground storage stuff and heavy, serious waste things that you can run into. Phase 1 and Phase 2 environmental studies are a big deal. And some of these laws are terribly onerous. Not likely that you're going to see this in the typical residential transaction. So you should probably know what a brownfield is. It's just a matter of understanding that the field is, the grass is brown, the field is dead, you can't grow anything there. That's the idea. The land is so contaminated, and we still have hundreds of thousands of properties like this all over the country. CERCLA was established in 1980 as a way to clean up some of these horrific sites. We had Love Canal in the 70s. It was in the late 1960s, I think, the Cuyahoga River outside of Cleveland spontaneously combusted. Imagine that. A river that's like one of your main drinking water sources other than the Great Lakes, all of a sudden is so polluted in chemicals because of 40 years of industrial activity, it literally burst into flame. It happened repeatedly over a number of years. So these are the kinds of things that were happening in the country in the 60s and in the 70s. If you're familiar at all with West Chicago and the thorium problem there, and the manufacturing in Kerr McGee, that was a huge cleanup that really probably will never really be fully finished. CERCLA was meant to address those kinds of problems. And the idea was to shift liability for the cleanup onto anybody who was in the chain of title. You might not even have caused the problem, but if you're in the chain of title and you got money, the government was going to go after you to pay for that. This PRP is potentially responsible party. Anybody in the chain of title might be responsible. Banks were up in arms about this. They're like, what if we take a property back in foreclosure? We didn't manufacture thorium on the site. There's a lot of thorium pollution right along Lake Michigan, right along where the Illinois Central Railroad used to run, down by Illinois Center and near the Aeon Center in that area in there, where this pollution was just dumped. The railroad just dumped the polluted earth and thorium and other materials into the lake intentionally so that they could have more land for tracks. So that's a big problem in some areas like that. They'll try and figure out who's responsible and get somebody to pay. But if you can, under SARA, this reauthorization, if you can prove that you did a phase 1 environmental assessment And then if anything turned up in the phase 1 report, you do a phase 2 to test the soil. If you go through these steps as a landowner and everything kept turning up negative, you'll probably be considered an innocent landowner later on if the problem emerges, because you've done everything that the law has asked you. So these environmental site assessments, the ESAs, just be aware of these terms in case you ever hear them. Again, this is more of an issue for commercial or industrial type property or real estate development in mass. A phase 1 is not an intrusive site investigation at all. A phase 1 environmental site assessment is a title search. You look at public records, who owned it? Because if there's somebody like Kerr McGee in the name, that should raise the red flag that, oh, maybe we need to go check and see what went on the site. If it was a heavy manufacturing facility of some kind, that kind of thing would trigger this. And it isn't necessarily just obviously dirty industries. Would it surprise you that like little retail strip centers could have had polluters in them? How about a dry cleaner? If a dry cleaner processes on site, those chemicals are toxic. And if they've ever had a spill, and trust me, dry cleaners spill stuff. If they've ever had a spill, that had to have been reported. And then once that gets reported, that building is now going to show up in a phase 1 as having a problem, and a phase 2 is going to be warranted. Printing companies, you know, working with certain inks or other materials that may be toxic. Somebody who processes photographs might have heavy metals in that processing. So you can have a lot of different uses. A paint company, a paint store in a building for years. And, I got to tell you that more often than not, more than once, I mean to say, somebody drops a 5-gallon bucket of latex paint and whoosh it goes all over the floor, all over the dock. What do you do with latex paint? Well, you get a big hose out and you wash it into the floor drain. You call the fire department and they dilute it even more. And that gets reported and everybody knows that there was a hazardous material spill. Latex paint is toxic when it's wet. If you roll it out and dry it, you can throw it in the garbage. And once it's dry, it doesn't rehydrate. Latex paint can be disposed of like any other garbage. But when it's wet, it's a toxic or hazardous material. So anything like that in that title search, or any other public records like reported spills that shows up in a phase 1 will require a phase 2. Now we're drilling in the soil. Now we're taking samples. Now we're testing for chemicals and proposing a solution. And I've been through a number of those, and it's not cheap. It's kind of fun science. If you're into tiny little microbes, you can put microbes in the soil which will eat up the bad stuff and poop out soil or fertilizer or whatever, stuff that's not toxic to humans. And this is the long, slow approach that many companies have decided to take when it comes to site remediation. Rather than dig up soil, haul it off to some special dump somewhere where it's forever going to be encapsulated, they'll instead inject it with microbes whose whole purpose in life, as far as humans are concerned, is to eat up the toxins and turn it into something that's not toxic. And as I mentioned before, those toxins travel. They might be on your property today, but next year they might be on the neighboring property. So doing an environmental site assessment is not only important for your site, but also if you're buying the site next door, you might have problems. I'm not going to worry at all about environmental impact statements. That's more of a development issue. Federal government requires those. Disclosure of environmental hazards of any kind, because it's a relevant material fact, is required, even if it doesn't show up on a disclosure form, even if we're talking about commercial property, vacant land, whatever. It's a relevant material fact. You owe that disclosure to the potential buyer. Interesting thing, to me at least anyway, about environmental hazards, they can take an expensive, nicely valued, well-located property and make it worth less than zero. A good example of that is the old railroad station in downtown Aurora. So if you're familiar at all with the history of Aurora, you know that the roundhouse that was there pre-Civil War, but that was for maintenance and turning trains. There was a turntable in there, etc. The train station, before it was put into the old roundhouse machine shops, which is what they call it now, was on Broadway, just past Benton, just south of Benton, where the tracks cross over Broadway. And the building, I think, is demolished now, but it was like a 3-story red brick building, and the tracks were all there, and the engines would come right up, almost right up to Broadway there, and sit, and the train storage yard. There was 17 acres of land there. Hasn't been developed. It hasn't been redeveloped, in part because there's millions of dollars of cleanup required to turn that into something. So when Shodine, the developer from Geneva, was looking at doing a major development downtown Aurora a number of years ago, part of that deal was that the city and the state were gonna pay to clean up the site. Now, I actually had a deal with a buyer who wanted to purchase that land in about 1999 or 2000. And I had to strike a deal with my buyer that said I would get paid a commission based upon what the value of the land should be if they were able to acquire it and have the state clean it up, because I was gonna do all this work, but the sale was gonna be for nothing. Literally, there wouldn't have been, the seller would have gladly transferred it, given it away, to get out from underneath millions of dollars of liability that he since found out that he had. Like, I think the seller was gonna go through bankruptcy as their best alternative. And how do you write a commission agreement? Because normally it's on a percentage of the sale if there's not gonna be a dollar amount. So we agreed to a fixed dollar amount for commission, because I warned the buyer, I don't think you really wanna buy this site, because it's probably gonna cost you more. If you get it for free, you're gonna spend too much cleaning it up. So then the deal never went through, but at least I did my job to sort of, here's the property, and oh, by the way, I don't think you really want it because of that kind of thing. Certainly, if you're gonna be in that scenario, you have to know that well enough. Questions at all about environmental problems or any of these hazardous materials or anything else related to that? All right, well, let's go ahead and take a break. Why don't we come back as soon as we can after 10 till, and we will pick up and shift over to chapter 21, or 23 rather. Just hit this flashing button again.